These are our guests from abroad. We're going to have to be very tight and disciplined here. Starting on my left, Fiamma Nierenstein from Italy and Israel, if I can say that. Konstanty Gebert from Poland. Henrik Bachner from Sweden. Patrick Dubois from France. Melanie Phillips from the United Kingdom. Margaret Brearley from the United Kingdom. And Daniel Dayan from France. Two simple questions, and what I ask is a concentrated 4-minute, concise answer to either one or the other or both, as you wish. The subject of anti-Semitism, first one, and I would say the basic question here is, how do you see the old and new anti-Semitism, and what do we do about it in the current situation, in the light of all the things that have been said and you yourself think? And the second issue relates really to the media, the impact of the mass media, of the global media, the local media, in promoting anti-Semitism or not promoting it. How do we cope with this phenomenon of the mass media? If you want to address only one of the two, that's fine, whatever you feel comfortable with. I think I'll start with Daniel Dayan, because he really conceptualized for us something important about the nature of the media.
Thank you. Should I screen or
Me too.
use the
Yeah, yeah, use, yeah, fine.
I think that it seems to me quite important to make a distinction between old.
Yeah, stand up. Come here, if you wish. You can come here, might be the, at there. Yeah, come here.
Thank you. I think first question, it seems to me quite important to make a distinction between old and new. It seems to me quite important to realize that you have features that are so original that it is important to relate them to anti. But in fact, this relationship should not blind us to their almost entirely original nature. In that, if you consider anti-Semitism as a process, this process relies on new techniques, and these techniques may use of a number of cultural resources which we have discussed here. I think that we have very much insisted on the cultural resources. It seems to me enormously important to insist on the process, and the process involves globalization, and it involves a sort of spread of stereotypes at a speed which is almost instantaneous, and the extraordinarily rapid construction of public opinion, which leads, for example, to a new type of demonstration. For the first time, perhaps in history, we have rapidly organized world demonstrations. So I think that the newness is essential. Now, and I think that I tend to rely on a number of notions which seem to me essential because I'm an academic. I think that it seems to me that there's these new forms are in fact not only connected to the past, but they are taught in a number of highbrow places as what constitute the new culture of tomorrow's elites. A number of these new forms are constituting the new commonplaces, the new shared values. And I think that a first and obvious task we have is to somehow combat the new epistemologies. You have a number of epistemologies that allow these new forms of anti-Semitism to spread. So it seems to me, I think that Professor Cutler gave a very beautiful examples of what can be done by working very specifically in the field of law. I think that, for example, it seems to me quite important, and this is how I tie to the second question, it seems to me quite important to deal in when you try, for example, to address media or media specialists, the prevalent notion, which was addressed yesterday, is that all media discourse are subjective, and that the opposition is between subjectivity and objectivity, which, by the way, is a little antiquated. I would say, as a way of addressing the question of objectivity. So I think that one of an enormous importance, one point of enormous importance is to address formally and systematically such issues as the issue of objectivity, and to address such issues as the way in which a postmodern epistemology is somehow substituting for a number of notions, like the notion of truth, the notion that to anyone we live in a new Pirandellian form of public sphere, and I think that this should be discussed and this should be addressed, and the way to discuss it and to address it has to do also with the formation of new elites. Now, what can we do? I think that it seems to me that to fight back by precisely stressing certain notions that not everything goes, that there are certain rules as to the conduct of law and as to the conduct of discourse, and it is possible to reply to the media. Now, how do you reply to the media in a situation which is the one I described the other day, where all the main people who would try to propose a critique of the media will be either silenced or defamed? Okay? What is possible? And I think that what could be possible is perhaps, for example, to use some of, instead of producing out of this conference a huge book, proceedings that will be very impressive, go directly to academic presses, to organize small books that will be thematically connected and that would address specific public spheres. For example, I just take something which struck me. It seemed to me that the different European participants had a very converging description of the situation, and this situation is such that if you publish the different European contributions in each of the European countries, they tend to reinforce each other. People might say, this particular man from this particular country is crazy and he's a fascist and he's a reactionary, etc. But then to find the same processes described in the next country and the same processes described in the third country, after a while people realize that maybe there's something to it. We should look into it. Maybe this is not pure hallucination on the part of someone, and it is very hard to artistically defame people that are not at your disposal because they live in another country. So this is a possible proposal.
Thank you. I'll certainly take that into consideration. It's an interesting idea, and thank you for that very useful analysis. If I could turn to Margaret. Oh, you'd like to go later on? How do you feel, Melanie? Are you ready to go?
I think the definition that we've heard from Professor Kotler is extremely important and useful. I personally very much agree that there is a new phenomenon here, a new anti-Semitism. I think that anti-Semitism is protean. It never goes away, but it changes its shape. And I think what we're seeing now is a change of shape, which is not understood at all. And the first thing to do is to persuade people that this is the same animal but taking a different shape, with obviously fundamental characteristics of the old anti-Semitism but taking a new form centered around this deliberate confusion of Israel, Jews and Zionism. What is the impact of the mass media in having absorbed this new paradigm without realizing it is actually a new anti-Semitism and promulgating it as fact? I think, and I can only speak in terms of my knowledge of Britain, although I've been very struck by the similarities with other European countries. But in Britain, the impact of the mass media in transmitting this set of prejudices is absolutely enormous. I'm thinking of people who I wouldn't have expected to have any knowledge of or interest in the Middle East, who are now convinced that Israel is the source of world terror. Their ignorance is profound. Their ignorance of Judaism, their ignorance of Israel, their ignorance of the Middle East, their ignorance of the rest of the world, their ignorance certainly of Arab states is profound. But they are persuaded of this. And why are they persuaded of this? Not so much the newspapers, although that has, and they have an influence. I personally think that the major influence is the broadcast media, and particularly the images on television, but also the biases on broadcast radio. People tend to assume that the BBC radio is the truth. And if you analyse and deconstruct the BBC's coverage on radio of the Middle East, it is anything but truth. It reflects a mindset which is pretty universal in the BBC. I can't overemphasise how universal it is, so much so that if you talk to BBC executives about this problem, they genuinely cannot understand what you're talking about because they themselves have the mindset. And as far as they're concerned, their mindset is not only right, it's moral. And therefore it cannot be challenged, and therefore anyone who is challenging it must be a party pre-lobbyist, and they say, well, you know, we understand where you're coming from and we listen carefully to your views, but basically we will not accept what you're saying. Now, it is a very, very difficult situation. What Danielle says is absolutely right about the vilification, the demonization of journalists and other public figures who try to challenge it. It is very difficult because clearly what has to be done, we all know what has to be done. The non-Jewish and the Jewish community has to be educated into realizing what's going on. But how do you do this without when you have a kind of circular problem, when the citadels of the culture, the broadcast media, the newspapers, publishing, are controlled by people who subscribe to this mindset? How do you break in? I mean, I'm a journalist, I have been here throughout this conference, I wish to write about it. I will find it very difficult to write about it. My paper is not interested in covering it. Other outlets are not interested in covering it. I have great difficulty in placing this material. I wish to write a book about the new anti-Semitism. I have a very hotshot agent. He thinks that my synopsis is very good. It is very powerful. It will sell a lot of books. I cannot get published. Publisher after publisher is turning me down, and the most recent publisher to turn me down is a liberal British Jew who has said, I will not publish this book because I think she is wrong. I do not agree with this analysis. It's hysterical nonsense. That's what we're up against. How do we break into it? I think the thing I would like to see is this conference put on in London. Or a conference like this put on in London, because once you have a high-profile conference, it kind of generates a momentum. Once you have the unsayable being said in public, it kind of generates a momentum, especially if you have it being said by people who are ultra-respectable, who are authorities, who know what they're talking about, as we've seen at this conference. It's very important for non-Jews to speak on this matter. Now, having said that the media are so terribly biased, there are a few righteous Gentiles, very few. I can count them on the fingers of one hand, but they do exist in the British media. They themselves are people of goodwill, but they themselves don't know the full extent of all this. So they themselves need to be educated, and they could be targeted for information, contacts, and so on, with a view to writing. If they start writing, again, it all helps create a momentum. Very important to the British Jewish community. British Jewish community split between the people who are not of the left, who basically believe all this, are frightened by it, understand it, and are beside themselves about what to do about it, but people who are of a liberal political persuasion or a left political persuasion in the Jewish community who, like this publisher, say this is hysterical nonsense, the root of the problem is the Nazi Sharon. And somehow one has to find a way of educating the Jewish community. The final thing is to persuade Israel itself to understand that this is a phenomenon that they every interest in, not to mention a responsibility to address. As we've seen from this conference, I mean, I've been very struck by the fact that Israeli journalists have been, let us say, not exactly on board with this analysis, and somehow a way has to be found of persuading Israel to take up this banner too.
I would sign on every word. Père Dubois?
I would approach only the question what to do. For me, is the main question for the year. When I entered this responsibility, my constat what was all the people were the fighters against anti-Semitism were old people, people who have been concerned with Holocaust. So in the church, what we decided slowly is to build a new generation of fighters. Because why the church are changing is because of only of a few persons that were in the leadership. So what we try actually is to give a special formation for people who will be in the leadership tomorrow. For example, I just come back from a formation that I gave in New York with 10 priests who are academics and will think bishop in a few years. And they studied for 10 days in the yeshivot of New York. It has never been before. We try to give them information about Holocaust in Poland, about Judaism, and also about Israel. Because in the church we are not democratic. It's a hierarchy. So if the hierarchy is convinced, after they will speak against their own media. I don't think also we can enter in a majority strategy. We try to stay in a strategy of a minority even inside the church. It's all what I want to say.
It's nice to hear a Catholic voice and those words. And now, Fiamma Nierenstein.
Oh, first, let me tell you that I'm very glad, because I'm very glad that we are discussing here how to fight. This is something, I think it's the first time we're doing it together from so many countries in such an important conference. It's really very important. Because we have a problem with ourselves. When I say we, I relate to all the people that think that there is really something to fight, in the sense that there is a really widespread and strong wave, let's call it wave, hopefully, of anti-Semitism, and that we have. Now, let me tell you a little story. In Italy, there have been plenty and plenty of episodes of anti-Semitism. One of the worst has been the request of boycott of the Israeli professors and lecturers in the Bologna, in the Foscari in Venezia University. Bologna, because unfortunately in Bologna there has been another letter after signed by 150 professors there that was telling incredible things. I have the translation here. Whoever will be interested, I will show it to him. But now I want to do it very quickly. So this letter put there the points that you are already very used to, which are the basic point of anti-Semitism today. Meaning the comparison between the persecuted of yesterday becoming the persecuted of today, and and whatsoever. I mean, I don't want to spend my time describing it again, what you have been hearing all of these days. That was a terrible shock. That was, and plenty of professors from other universities, Bari, Urbino University, they were all signing after this request. I will quote you now a comment from a very, very, very high positioned Jewish leader in Italy. His comment, which made the title in a page of Il Corriere della Sera, was, "Oh my God, this way they are playing in the hands of Sharon." That was the comment of a high positioned Jewish leader. Let's say one of the highest in all the Italian horizon. So when I say this, what do I mean? That we have an awful, terrible problem which relates very much with the finding a new definition of this new anti-Semitism, and I agree completely with what Irving said, and I'm not going to go back to that, and not aligning oneself with the people that you traditionally believe to be people that are the traditional defenders of the Jewish, namely the left. So what this important man did was not to condemn anti-Semitism in name of his old alliance with this side of the Italian intellectual society and political society. So what I mean by this is that we still have to find a stand, a steady and strong stand in understanding that the main point of this new anti-Semitism is Israel. Is Israel as a whole that we have to continue, if we want, as in any democratic society, to comment and to criticize on Israeli politics, but the place is not absolutely when we discuss about anti-Semitism. Here, Israel become the main issue, anti-Semitism and anti-Sharon, let me say today, even. Not even anti-Israelism, even anti-Sharon. Now, I'm sorry to say that for all the people that likes and sometimes rightly so to criticize Sharon. To say nowadays that Sharon is evil for the several passages that Erwin had described before is exactly the same thing. So we have to take a stand about this, and how do we do it? Now I tell you another small episode. Tarek Aziz was in Italy, you know that, and he gave a press conference, and the Israeli Jewish journalist stood up and said, "I want to ask you a question," and he said, "I'm not going to answer to Israeli. Are you going to ask to any Jew?" "No, I'm not in the state of mind of discussing with Jews." So the ex-communist mayor of the town of Rome, who is certainly a Smolani, a left-wing person, a 50 years old ex-revolutionary, and still today strongly on the left, said, "I'm not going to meet Tarek Aziz," and refused the meeting because what? Because there the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Israeliness had been exposed so clearly in the eyes of the mass that that the people standing for the human and for the human rights, and again I quote Erwin here, could not stand the exposition that was given to this nesso. How do you say nesso? Kesher. Connection, link, but even more than that. Nesso. Sì, ecco. So now let's have it very clear that the problem with the fact that this exposition has not yet been shown completely springs very much from Israel. This, again, this must be very, very important. Now, let's say, nowadays an Holocaust cannot again happen. We say this all the time because Israel is there, right? We have to take Israel then, not only as, let's say, the negative pole of the connection between new anti-Semitism, but also as the positive pole of the fight against anti-Semitism. So Israel must stand on our side. Israel cannot allow itself to come as it did, and you said it very well, last night with some representatives of theirs and say that anti-Semitism, what is this? It's comic for me. That was the horrific to my eyes, and it's forbidden. Israel, in the moment when we say Israel will never allow again the Holocaust to come over, must also be there not to allow that anti-Semitism come over. So what we have to do today is to stand for Israel if we want to fight anti-Semitism. There is nothing to do. And Israel to stand for the diaspora if we want to win. So now this is my proposal.
Thank you very much. Henrik, and then you.
agree very much with what has been said here. I think what we have seen during these days of the conference is that anti-Semitism today has certain new features and old features, that there are different layers of anti-Semitism, that it looks different in societies to some extent, but there are also, of course, very much common themes and common problems. No doubt the Islamist anti-Semitism is the most potential threat of the day and should be addressed. But we also have the problem of anti-Semitism as a form of anti-Zionism within the radical left in Europe, and it is becoming increasingly visible within certain parts of the anti-globalization movement. And one could very much see that there is a wish, a tendency to make Israel the new Vietnam of the coming decade, a symbol, the slogans of a global intifada, anti-globalization groups in Sweden selling T-shirts with "Burn Israel, Burn" on them has its very clear message. There are also anti-Jewish attitudes and myths within the mainstream and among intellectuals, and what we have not discussed, of course, within the populist and extreme right in Europe. So there are different targets that we have to deal with, sometimes, I believe, with different methods. But what I see as problematic, many of these phenomena can, on certain topics, is merged, and there can be a snowball effect. And one myth I would like just then to focus on, which I see as maybe the most dangerous today when you look at Europe and how it is also affecting normal political discourse, normal political debate, the mainstream, is the growing belief, as has been mentioned, that Islamist terrorism is caused by Israel, that Europeans are threatened because of Israeli policies and because of their support, if you like, or just affiliation with Israel, and that the key to stop or dampen this threat entirely lies with Israel. This view, which has with it, it's not unlike Christian and secular views of Jews as the prime cause of apocalyptic catastrophes and as a stick in the wheel or a hindrance of redemption, of human progress and love. This view will increase the animosity and bitterness against Israel and Jews, and can become very explosive. There is, of course, also an additional risk when we look at the scenario of a war in Iraq, where many of those who oppose a war in Iraq also shares this view, this interpretation of terrorism, and that it can very well, they also share the idea that it is a powerful Jewish lobby in America who is influencing American policy. You know, we have these code words in certain European countries when you use the word East Coast or the East Coast establishment in the German-speaking culture. It is, of course, a code word for the Jews for in America. In Sweden, sometimes I have seen also in Britain, when you speak of the neoconservatives who influence Bush and forces him to go to war, it is also often a code word for Jews, and you continuously mention and point out Jews in these circumstances. This is a myth that has to be diffused and worked with very much. How do we do that? Many good suggestions have been here. I have no miracles whatsoever, but I would say, even though maybe Simcha Epstein would criticize me, that because you have pointed out that we always come back to the same methods during history. It's the same instruments to combat anti-Semitism, and they have shown to be not very effective all the time. But we must not rule out traditional instruments such as information, of course, working through the media, but also education, and I would say also legal means in the way that it can exist. And if you look on a domestic level, combating anti-Semitism, just let me finish by just giving one example. Radio Islam, which is today probably the largest website of anti-Semitic hatred on the internet, a huge website on maybe 10 or 15 languages with the protocols of the Elders of Zion, revisionist material and so on, was put on trial for incitement in the end of the 80s, beginning of the 80s in Sweden. at that time it had the backing of many intellectuals in Sweden who said that this was not at all anti-Semitism. This was perfectly legitimate criticism of Israel. And until there was a trial, and Ahmed Rami, who was the head of this station, was sentenced to 6 months in prison for incitement, this growing opinion approving of his hate became silenced. That they were delegitimized by a trial. So we should not rule out using where there are laws against incitement, they should be used. Thank you.
Thank you for that suggestion. Konstantin, would you like to go next?
There were moments at this conference when I felt as an infiltrator from the enemy camp, actually a double infiltrator, because not only am I a working journalist, but I'm a leftist. Until you shoot me, I'd like to make a few practical recommendations on working with the media, because this seems to me absolutely crucial. First of all, media need to sell to readers. For the overwhelming majority of the readers of the European media, this is an unimportant conflict. Unimportant in the sense that they do not have any personal stake in it whatsoever. For Israelis and for Arabs, it's the most vital thing on the planet. For Jews and for Muslims, it may be important very much or somewhat. For the rest of humanity, it is utterly unimportant, and therefore one can have the luxury of taking a stand for which one pays nothing. And it is so much easier, therefore, to identify with whom you perceive as the underdog and get this groovy feeling of being moral without having to pay anything for it. This is a very powerful force. You need to acknowledge it. You can't simply argue it out of existence. Incidentally, if you think of what would reverse the stereotype, well, if Jews would be started getting murdered in serious numbers by uniformed Arabs, this would probably reverse the trend. I'm not very sure if we want to improve our public image that way. And also, be grateful that it is unimportant for the vast majority of humanity, because the numbers are not with us. So this is the first thing we must bear in mind, that in a way, even before the first arguments are heard, the jury is stacked against us. Second, there are no quick fixes. It is a bureaucratic illusion to believe that a rectification or a press release affects reality. It might affect the reality of the author. It certainly does not affect the reality of the recipient. It ends up in the garbage paper basket, and rightly so. This is a very complicated conflict. For those of us who live it, either immediately or because we're Jewish, even if we do not live in Israel, we live it. The ups and downs, the vicissitudes, are present to us like events from our everyday lives. Most people don't know if Sabra Shatila is in Sinai or Sinai in Sabra and Shatila, and don't care. It is not with one press release or one rectification that one will correct this. The only way to work is to cultivate journalists and know that this will take time. And the only way that we can be effective cultivating journalists is by presenting them not with propaganda, but with facts, including uncomfortable and unpleasant facts, including helping them have access to the other side. We cannot control the information. This is a myth. What we can influence is how the information is being read. And we can influence it in a positive sense only when we ourselves are credible. This means do not be afraid of criticizing Israel. There is an obvious rallying around the banner feeling, which is eminently understandable and totally counterproductive. We will be seen as criticizing the anti-Israeli or anti-Semitic stance of the media because we are pro-Israeli. Our effectiveness is zilch. It is only when we are credible as sources of information, and this means if we are able to criticize ourselves and the side we stand on, can we hope to have a... It also means that we have to accept, for instance, that many people decide to take a position which is anti-Israeli and anti-Semitic out of extremely noble motives. If you are 20, all you know about this conflict is TV, and all you see on TV is kids and tanks, you'd be a scoundrel not to take this side. If you attack that person for making this choice, you're attacking not a stupid choice, but moral values, which in fact work for our side. If we attack him for making that choice, telling him he's an anti-Semite, he's a supporter of terrorists and whatever, we only convince him that his moral choice was right and that we are evil. By the same token, we should not make, in my opinion, much use of accusations of anti-Semitism, even if eminently justified, for two separate reasons. One, those accusations have been abused. Yes, it is legitimate to believe in the Brigitte Bardot might be more beautiful than Golda Meir. We have overused accusations of anti-Semitism. They're less effective. Second, and more unpleasant, even if they had not been overused, is an extremely double-edged sword. For the noble minority, if anti-Semitism is demonstrated, this will be a reason to react. Most Europeans have skeletons not only in their cupboards, they carry them around in their consciousness. You prove that to the other guy that his motivation is anti-Semitic, the result more probably will be that he'll stop liking you instead of mending his ways. Do not, yeah, I'm winding up. Do not make the mistake that the left in Israel made during the Oslo process, when we preferred to be right than to know what we're talking about. And finally, and last point, we had this extremely interesting debate yesterday before about whether an appeal to Republican values in the context of anti-Semitism in France makes sense. Sima Epstein is absolutely right. It's been tried and tried and tried, isn't terribly effective. But what is the alternative? I mean, where would we be now if it were not possible, even in a haphazard way, not terribly effectively, to mobilize solidarity in the name of common interest? The most effective way is to indicate that a common interest, not common morality, common interest, militates in favor of adopting a more balanced or possibly pro-Israeli position. There is an extremely popular news weekly in Poland, and with this I conclude, 9% of the readership, which is very strongly pro-Israeli, and therefore very strongly anti-Semitic, not because anybody there really cares much about Israel or the Jews one way or the other, but because the editor-in-chief and his top staff had made a decision that Poland's security lies in a close alliance with the United States. And if we can support something that the US supports without paying any price for it, well, so much better for us. It is this way, and not by pointing out anti-Semitism or unconditionally defending Israel, that we can hope to be effective, hopefully.
Thank you for those provocative remarks. And now, finally, Margaret.
I'm going to use a non-Jewish Hovevei Tzion, and traditionally non-Jewish Hovevei Tzion have been eccentric. George Eliot, Ord Wingate, and many others have all been eccentric. So my short few minutes are going to be eccentric. I love the last line of Adon Olam, Adon Ali velo ira. God is with me. But in Psalm 100, God is with me, I have no fear. Psalm 119, the full verse is, God is with me, I have no fear. How can man affect me? Hashem, God is with me, my helpers. We are the helpers of the Jewish community, of the Jewish people. We are the watchmen on the walls, because we have knowledge. As in Pirkei Avot, Hanina ben Dosa said, when a person's good deeds exceed his wisdom, wisdom will endure. There is enormous wisdom in this conference. And I believe that the times are urgent, and we must translate that wisdom into needs. I agree absolutely with Owen Kotler. I do believe that the ideology that we are confronting is genocidal. Already back in 1988, 1990, I was trying to warn, even in the House of Parliament lectures that I gave, that there were ideologies both within Shiite and Sunni Islamism and within certain Western ideologies which perceived a triangle of evil existing, namely in the USA, Jews and Zionism, Israel, and that this ideology was potentially genocidal. And nobody really believed me then. People thought I was mad. I believe now that this is an absolutely valid perception to have, and we must point this out. I believe that we must stress the role of ideology. Certainly in Britain, people are completely unaware of ideology and unaware of the ideology of genocide, which does evil, and that when one points this out to people, they take it seriously very often. I don't believe it's right that one can't change intellectuals' minds. I've given many dozens of lectures on Richard Wagner and Richard Wagner's ideology, often to passionate Wagnerians, even to a Wagnerian society. And I have found that after those lectures, people's hearing of Wagner changes. And to be if one can change passionate Wagnerians, one is going to be able to change at least a few neutral or anti-Zionists. And I believe that stressing ideology is a key way to doing that. Just one example. Barachot, it says, read not banaich, but bonaich, not children, but builders. Since 1993, children in the Palestinian Authority have been turned not into builders, but into destroyers and self-destroyers, in a way not unequivalent to Hitler Youth. But people don't see that when they see their television screens. We need to point out the dire consequences for the Palestinian people of the ideology which they are being taught, as well as the potential dangers for Israel in this training up of a generation of killers. I think we need to think innovatively. David Hartman wrote a wonderful book about Judaism called The Innovative Tradition. In Judaism, the Jewish people are essentially deeply innovative. And I think that means that strategic thinking should be innovative. I know that Hollywood film directors, because of their power of imagination, have been brought in by CIA, FBI in America to help with the fight against terrorism because they can envisage scenarios. We need to be imaginative in finding new ways how to bring our message to the media and to others. Just in one example of strategic planning, every single year at Christmas and Easter, those timings are used as a way of propaganda within the Christian world against Israel. That should be foreseen, and I don't see why it wouldn't be possible for both people like us and especially Israel to actually provide surprises which will actually be positive and proactively transform the way the Christian world sees the Holy Land at Christmas and Easter. Can I have another couple of minutes? I think it's absolutely essential that we have a radical presence at things like the Trades Union Congress. At the Trades Union Congress this year, not one representative of Israel other than an extremely who stood up for Israel brilliantly. It's essential that at all the major fora there are representatives, powerful, passionate, informed representatives of a point of view which is at least preferably pro-Zionist. And I believe it's essential to talk to leaders and again try and convince leaders, parliamentarians and others of the power of ideology which is facing Israel. I think it's possible to change perspective by, for example, pointing out some of the positive aspects of Israel. Just two examples. Zaka. We need to actually show people the power of these men who not only collect up so lovingly the bodies of victims, but those of the suicide bombers as well. So much does Israel value human life, including of the suicide bombers. The fact that more soldiers were killed in Jenin than I believe the Allies lost in the, I think, Kosovo and Afghanistan. Facts like this we need to stress in order to change people's perspective. I think a minor point, but it's important, captatio benevolentiae is an absolutely prime key in oratory. It's been taught in rhetoric for 2,000 and more years. Israel does not use rhetoric or oratory. It is essential, I believe, that all representatives of Israel who come out are trained in rhetoric and public speaking. I believe I've mentioned to others we need an Israeli Hanan Ashrawi. We need a fine Israeli woman representative who speaks brilliant English, and I believe also in time we have to have an Ethiopian who will speak on Israel's behalf. Sorry, I said that to others, but I believe to have an Ethiopian is also important. And my last eccentric point, if you'll allow me, I heard several years ago, I heard a Rosh Yeshiva arguing that the words of the Torah are very powerful, and that Golda Meir and Ben Gurion, whatever their private religious status might well have been, and I suspect they were in many ways rather secular, though, as you know, Rav Kook had this vision of the most secular Israeli, actually, as he put it, being bathed in the radiant sanctity from above and doing the work of high priest. Forgive me, Felix Posen. I'm not going against secular at all. Indeed, Rav Kook loved secular Zionism. But that this Rosh Yeshiva argued that the words of the Torah are essentially creative and powerful to the non-Jewish world. And he argued that actually Jewish leaders need to use words of Torah when they are speaking in public fora to the non-Jewish world. It resonates, and it has an extraordinary power. And my very last point is we named our son, the son who's just died, Joshua, because of the wonderful words in Joshua and in the last parsha in Deuteronomy, because in a sense we wanted his name to embody that wonderful verse, which I'm going to give to you as my last words. Be strong and very courageous. Be not afraid, neither be thou dismayed, for the Lord thy God is with thee. Bless you. Thank you.
Thank you really for those moving words and a very apt conclusion to this part of the proceedings. We are now going to turn to the final concluding lecture. We're very honored, and I think it's entirely appropriate that Professor Yehuda Bauer will now, by way of summation, bring together, I'm sure in his own distinct, unique way, all the themes which have been percolating through these 3.5 days. No one, I think, is better fitted, better suited to do this than the founder of the Vidal Sassoon Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism, a person whom I hardly need now to recount all of his many intellectual and public achievements, who is very active and certainly very far from being retired, who goes around the world and lectures with tremendous force and passion and conviction, and I think it's now the right moment for Yehuda to say his words.
Thank you, Robert. It is really a matter for wonderment that people attend a conference which basically speaks about how and why they hate us, and stick it out until late into Friday lunchtime. It is, I think, a sign of constructive masochism, which is quite unusual and very commendable. How does one summarize a conference? Like a good dinner, you know, it's appetizer and soup and main course and dessert and wine and coffee and Chinese cookies. And all you can really say about it is that it was a very good dinner. The potatoes were a bit over. There was too much sugar in the dessert, but it was all right. It was very good. And I can't really summarize it. What I'm going to do is to make a few comments, both on what was said and what was not said. I think we should realize that we are using the wrong term. Anti-Semitism is an anti-Semitic term invented by an anti-Semite in 1879. Wilhelm Marr was looking for a neutral word, a new word, instead of Judenhass. Jew hatred, which had Christian theological implications. And he was anti-Christian. He was a nationalist, biological racist of those days. He was looking for a term that wouldn't mention Jews, that would sound scientific, and that could be used in his kind of approach to the Jews. The term itself is absolutely idiotic. There is no Semitism that you can be anti to. There are no Semites. There are Semitic languages, including Amharic, Ugaritic, Akkadian. Are you anti-Akkadian? Everybody knew he was referring to Jews. And then the supreme idiocy is for the Anglo-Saxons to hyphenate it with a capital S in the middle. Anti-Semitism with a capital S. At least use it in the original nonsensical terms. Antisemitismus, which means nothing and means everything. Because you see, you include in it Egyptian priest Manetho, a couple of hundred before the Common Era, who hated Jews, probably because they were settling in Alexandria and had a separate community. And it includes people who put up notices, used to put up notices in their hotels, only for Christians, and includes people who had economic problems with their Jewish neighbors. It includes Nazis. You make no differentiation between periods of time and different attitudes of Jews, some of which were purely xenophobic. Jews were not seen any other than other disliked minorities, not specially anti-Jewish, also anti-Jewish. From there to National Socialism, or to the ultimate development of Marxist, Leninist, Stalinist communism, is a long way. And we don't differentiate. We use the same term for the whole business. So now you're going to say, now he's going to suggest a new term. Well, forget it. Because you can't do that. First of all, no academic gathering has ever invented a new term that took hold. Secondly, I don't want to waste the few years that I have left in order to invent new terminology. That's silly. Almost as silly as the term of anti-Semitism. So what I suggest is that we do the second best. We realize we are using the wrong term and continue to use it. But this is very important, because in our discussion the last couple of days, we were using the term anti-Semitism for different phenomena, and we do not differentiate. You see, that's the overcooked potatoes. Now, when you look at Western media anti-Semitism, and by Western is such a, again, we use terms that make absolutely no sense. Western civilization. That includes Japan and Korea and Taiwan, I suppose. India. It's Western civilization. I'm reminded, some of you may know this, of the story, apocryphal probably, but maybe true, who knows, of Gandhi coming in 1937 to London for one of these interminable conferences on the future of India. And Gandhi being Gandhi, came with sandals and the sari and the stick. And then he goes into Whitehall alone as usual, and he wanders around and doesn't find his way. And he wanders from one big room to another, and suddenly he comes, across him stands a young BBC reporter of those days, with that whole paraphernalia, you know, with a stick and the thing and so on and so forth. And that's the chance of his life, an exclusive interview with a great Mahatma. And he asks, would you give me an interview? And Gandhi, being Gandhi, said, yes, okay. So he quickly sets up with his papers, you know, puts everything in place, and then he doesn't know what to ask. because he wasn't prepared for this. So he asked the first question that comes to his mind, and he says, Mahatma, what do you think of Western civilization? And Gandhi says, it would be a good idea. So you see, you have these concepts that we use. Now, as academics, I think we should be a little bit more careful, differentiated with the words that we use. These are our tools, that's our weapons. Simcha is sitting right next to me here. And there was a little bit of joking around his waves. And I suggest we stop joking about it. Discussions I had with him, I don't think he realizes what he has contributed to our understanding of the workings of anti-Semitism. Because in that small ACTA paper, there are implications that are revolutionary for our understanding. He found out that since 1945 and before the present wave, there were 3 waves of anti-Semitism, one more powerful and harmful than the other. And they took place simultaneously all over the quote-unquote Western world. And that at least one of them was not caused by any economic downturn, which explodes all our neo-Marxist explanations of where anti-Semitism comes from. It comes from other things, including often to also economic reasons. But, you know, they are not the cause. They are the trigger. And there is a magma beneath the surface of what we call latent anti-Semitism that bursts forth because it is a cultural phenomenon of antiquity. Anti-Jewish ideology, and that's the $64,000 question, and I am not going to get $64,000 for answering it, unfortunately. The basic reason for anti-Semitism, I'm absolutely convinced, is that the Jews developed a culture and a civilization that was neither better nor worse than any other. It was and is different. The Jews are not a race. We are black and white and brown, various hues. We are about as pure a race as any Jerusalem street poodle. But we have a distinctive culture, which developed over time, which developed in situations of contradictions and conflicts. Start off like that, which developed. Judaism of the Second Temple is not the Judaism today. Don't tell me stories. It's different. But one is the development from the other. Secular Jews, and I'm a secular Jew, are part of a tradition that starts with the beginnings of Jewish consciousness in the Bible. So postmodernists, post-Zionists, posts tell us that there's no such thing as Jewish nationality. Well, you know, it looks like a duck, it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck. It's a duck. Call it a cupboard if you like. There is a Jewish culture and civilization which is distinct. And the reason why it is different is not because the Jews invented monotheism. They didn't. The Egyptians did. The Jews didn't invent the Shabbat. The Babylonians did. The word Shabbat is a Babylonian word. But put it in a new context. And had the Jews stayed in this country of acrobatic agriculture, on the hillsides, the terraces, and all that, Who would have cared? So there's another oddity. But they spread in the world. Not because they were driven out. That's another legend, a stupid legend. Jews were never driven out by the Romans from here. It's a legend. 20, 30,000 Jews were taken slaves by the Romans and sold on the slave markets of the Roman Empire. And there was a Jewish majority in this country until the Muslim conquest. And most of the Jews that lived in the Roman Empire were not descendants from the Jews that came from here. They were converts to Judaism. But they joined what the Jews called the seed of Abraham. It wasn't the seed of Abraham. It doesn't matter. Who cares? They joined this culture and civilization. And because they spread all over the world, they attracted attention. Obviously, a small minority. You don't eat with the others because you have dietary laws. You don't work with the others because you have a separate day of rest. You don't intermarry with others because you do on it. Sometimes you speak a different language or a different dialect. You have different customs. It didn't always provoke opposition. The history of the Jews is not a history of anti-Semitism. Forget it. Anti-Semitism is part of this. In most times, in most periods of time, in most places, Jews were not persecuted. They may not have been loved. Love thy neighbor is an impossible commandment. But they were accepted. Sometimes merely tolerated. Sometimes invited. Sometimes appreciated. It depends. Why do I say all this? Because we have to get to the bottom of this. The new wave of anti-Semitism started a few years ago was not caused by the conflict in this area. The conflict triggered it. And that's a big distinction. And that's your fourth wave, Simcha. And I'm sorry you were right, but you were right. And now you see, when you look at it that way, what is the conclusion from that wave theory? It rises and it passes. Jews, Simcha said, think they contribute to the passing away of the waves. But that's an illusion. And there I disagree. I don't think it is an illusion. The contribution of the Jews in fighting anti-Semitism may be small or may be larger. And sometimes it fails. It failed in Germany, clearly. But the examples that Simcha gave in his paper here prove the opposite, I think, of what he said. During the Dreyfus trial, the Jews tried to combine the Jewish and the general Republican French interest. And he said it didn't work. It did work. I am aware, I think, of a historical fact that Dreyfus was exonerated. That the Dreyfusards won the day. The Dreyfusards were defeated. That the French Republic regained its integrity by rehabilitating Dreyfus. I don't know whether the Jews contributed to it in some way. They certainly were not out of that line of argument today. And in the 1930s, when the Jews in France accepted the same kind of policy and same kind of strategy, there was the law of April 1939 against anti-Semitism. I don't know whether they contributed to it. Maybe yes, maybe no. But it was in line of the historical development that led to the new law against anti-Semitism, because it was seen as a law not in favor of Jews, but in favor of the defense of the French Republic. It was abolished by the Vichy government. But in the 1930s it worked. There is no way that the Jews can fight anti-Semitism alone. Margaret just said it. I'm glad you stole my thunder. Because without non-Jews, the Jews are lost in their fight against enmity. And there are people who will stand on our side. And that's so important. Now you see, when you look again, who are the anti-Semites in the Western world? The people who identify with what they see as an underdog, the Palestinians. We discussed a lot about media here, and much of it was very, very important. We branded Western media as exaggerating, as lying, as distorting the facts on the ground. All this is absolutely true. But when you deduct from the distortions and the lies and the misrepresentations and the ideological biases and everything else, when you detract, when you deduct all that from the situation, you are left with a residue. And the residue is that Israel often is wrong in its treatment of the Palestinian population. The only way that we can be credible, as been said here before, and I know I'm expressing a minority view, and I don't care. I very rarely express the majority view anyway. I think that the only way that you can combat anti-Semitism, the distortions, is by saying they are distortions, and we certainly are not beyond criticism. But at the same time, you've got to say that what Arafat and his crew are saying about the Jews is not a denial of Israel. It's the denial of the existence of a Jewish people. And that there can be no lasting solution to this crisis without a mutual recognition that will be really mutual. And that means that as I will not deny your right to be a Palestinian nationalist, and it doesn't matter that nationalism and Palestinian nationalism is a new phenomenon. It makes no difference. If you think that you are a Palestinian nationalist, you are a Palestinian nationalist, and you've got every right in the world to have your own autonomy, independence, culture, and whatever. But that means that you must recognize me no less than you recognize yourself. This is, you see, this is where I think anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Clearly. Now, you could be an anti-Zionist theoretically if you said that every people in the world should abandon its nationality. We should be universal, brothers, sisters, wonderful. Well, that's not the real world, is it? We are herd animals. We are herd animals. We are mammals that act just like other mammals do. We move in groups. Small, big. Now, if you say that everybody else in the world, Fiji, Maldives Islands, Togo, I don't know where, everybody else has the right to independence and national sovereignty. Or at least, if you're a small minority in some country, the Lucian Sorbs in East Germany, you know, the Bretons in France. Autonomy, language, except for the Jews. Then you are not just an anti-Zionist, you are an anti-Semite, because you oppose towards the Jews an attitude that you would never dream of denying. Amongst the anti-Semites, there are Jewish anti-Semites. We had a prime example here. Specialist by Sivan, but there are others like that. This is not a new phenomenon in Jewish history, as many of you know. It's something happens all over the place. Because when you are part of a minority, persecuted or threatened minority, you want to identify with anyone except for that minority. You want to rescue yourself, save yourself. You want to be with a majority that's against that minority, which you are part. A compromise between Israel and the Palestinians, between the Jews, the Jewish people, the Jewish nation, and the Palestinians, would not solve the issue. It would diffuse some of it. Very important part. It might possibly send these Jewish anti-Semites into the oblivion they so richly deserve. So we have many reasons to combine our view to make it more global. I haven't heard here, as the West is concerned, a clear differentiation between the Muslim minorities in Europe and the old established populations. Because you know there is a radical change going on. 18 million Muslims in Europe today, and we continue to keep counting. They are not all radical anti-Semites by any means. In fact, most of them are not. There are Kurds and there are Turks. There are Africans. There are many people from different countries. But where French anti-Semitism seems to come up in the last few years with the attacks on Jews and Jewish institutions, overwhelmingly, some argue, only Muslims were part of it. Even if they were not, even if there was here and there some French, original French participation, there has to be a differentiation. You have to address these things in a differentiated manner because there are different motivations. Somebody said here, ignore the motivations. No, that's the core, that's the crux of the matter. Now, where does this European American phenomenon come from? Apart from the magma, the difference. Well, there's a long tradition. To say that today's anti-Semitism is nationalist and racial biological is a mistake. It's a combination. There are Christian elements among it. In the Islamic world, there are clear Islamic elements among it. In it. You cannot differentiate so much. It's a combine of these things. Racial biological anti-Semitism, which is anti-Christian, nationalist anti-Semitism, which may be sometimes with Christian overtones, but it's basically secular. Christian anti-Semitism is the core of it, because there's where the symbols come from. There's where the language comes from. And this new kind, a modern kind of anti-Semitism, where theological anti-Semitism, which is the cause, one of the main causes of the whole phenomenon, where it comes to the fore is when you look at what symbols the racial biological anti-Semites and the nationalist anti-Semites use. They are Christian symbols where Christianity has been taken out of it. Christian anti-Semitism without Christianity. It's like the Cheshire cat. It disappeared, and only the smile remained. In this case, the grimace. Let me say one thing about a problem that hasn't been raised here, which is, to me, a symbol of what others, especially Irving, have been talking about. Belgium. Now, you know, I think that Sharon was guilty of, bears indirect responsibility for the massacre in Sabra and Shatila. I'm not alone in that. The Kahan Commission, which was set up in the country, saw him as indirectly responsible for that massacre. And it suggested a punishment. He cannot be a Minister of Defense anymore, anytime. Okay. But when, you know, somebody comes along in that great country of Belgium, which has such a wonderful history of colonial treatment in Congo, and says, we ignore the judicial procedures in a democratic country, Israel, and we don't charge the Christians who committed the massacre there. The senator from Belgium over the radio, I heard him, said, well, we will. Well, he hasn't. At the moment, it's Ariel Sharon. And I thought to myself, indirect responsibility, my foot. What about Rwanda? Where was the Belgian government with its troops in Rwanda in the spring of 1994? They ran. Where was the United Nations? The general in charge of the United Nations troops in Rwanda in the spring of 1994 was the Canadian General Roman Dallaire. You know him. Dallaire sent a message to the United Nations Assistant Undersecretary responsible for the troops in Rwanda, saying, I have detailed information of what is going to happen here unless we intervene. It's going to be a massacre. And the Undersecretary said, you are not permitted to use the troops, and he withdrew most of the troops that Dallaire had so that Dallaire couldn't use them. And the name of that Undersecretary is Kofi Annan. That's not a few hundred hapless, poor victims, Palestinians in Sabra and Shatila. That's 800,000 Tutsi. And I went to Eli Rubinstein. There's a close connection between the two of us. He was my pupil once. And I said to him, Eli, if this comes up, have a Belgian court faced with the accusation that Mr. Kofi Annan was indirectly responsible for mass murder in Rwanda. See what happened. And he said, excellent idea. And nothing was done. I'll come back to that because I'll want to say something about some of the practical proposals that were made here, what to do. But you know, there is a differentiation that I would like to make between Western anti-Semitism in the media and otherwise and Islamic radicalism or radical Islam. These are not part of the same phenomenon. They are qualitatively different phenomena. There is a latent anti-Semitism in what we call the Western world, of course, we know that. There'll be ups and downs, and connected with the local situations and various other local situations and crises here and there. But if there's a compromise reached between Israel and the Palestinians, there may be some diffusion, yes, of Islamic radicalism, some weakening, perhaps. It will not solve the issue. It will not solve the problem. Because there is a qualitative difference between one kind of anti-Semitism and another kind of anti-Semitism. Menachem Milson, who is my teacher in these things, use the term fundamentalist Islam. I think that's absolutely wrong. Now, radical Islam is fundamentalist, but so are many other religions or parts of religions. Jews believe that only to them did God speak, and they have the task to inform the rest of the world of what God wants the rest of the world to do. The Catholic Church to this day says, extra ecclesiam non est salus. There is no salvation outside of the church. And Protestant Christianity sees being saved by the grace of Jesus as the only way to salvation. And then, only then, lux perpetuam dona eis. The Buddhists say that if you don't follow the ways of the Buddha, you will be reborn, maybe as a frog next time, and the stork that swallows the frog after that. I don't know. Different types of hell, of damnation in the religions of the world. So, that is fundamentalism. Fundamentalism is the literal interpretation of your whole text and the demand that you act on that literal interpretation. The term fundamentalism is an American term introduced by an English preacher called William Danby in the early 19th century, where he called upon the Protestant world in the United States to return to the fundamentals, which meant a literal interpretation of the text and following the most extreme interpretation of that text in everyday life. And of course the denial of any other religious understanding. And so you have fundamentalisms in a number of religions, in all religions. But you also have non-fundamentalists in such religions who accept the view that the others may possibly have something right to say, that deny literal interpretations of texts, that try to interpret holy texts to fit the new situations, that are open to dialogue and discussions in all religions, in Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Buddhists, Shinto, whatever. Islamic radicalism is also fundamentalist. It goes beyond that. Now, if you want to understand their anti-Semitism, why don't you ask what their ideology is? And their ideology is so clearly stated. And thanks to memory, we can actually look at it. It's not so difficult to find out. It's been translated. And whether you look at Said Qutb, or al-Maududi, or al-Salih, or Qaradawi, or others, when you look at these people and you read what they say, for heaven's sake, haven't we learned that when people are convinced of their fanatic ideology, they will not only say it, they will try to act it out? And what they say is, we want the control of the world, not of Muslim world, of the world. We want to establish an Islamic dictatorship in the world. They say it. They mean it. And that Islamic dictatorship will be a lovely utopia. Priests on top, and everybody will follow. And those who remain in their erroneous ways will, of course, be denied any kind of rights if they survive. This is directed against Jews and Christians and Hindus. And women. That's a separate issue. Sure, you're right. But they don't want to exterminate women. They need them. Now you see, this is a utopian totalitarianism. It's an apocalyptic utopian totalitarianism because that is the end of history. After that, after the establishment of the Islamic dictatorship, there is no more history. And we will be run by Islamic wise men. as you rightly pointed out, women don't count. They go beyond that. People talk here about Arab and Muslim. You don't realize, do you, that Muslim radicalism is anti-national. Hamas and Islamic Jihad, read it. Want not a Palestinian national state, they want an Islamic state in Palestine. It's something quite different. It's part of an Islamic world. They are anti-national. Said Qutb, the ideological founder of modern radical Islam, was executed in 1966 by the Nasser regime in Egypt because he turned against Arab nationalism. And we, in our great wisdom as Israelis, unite all of them against us. The radical Islamists with whom we cannot talk, there's nothing to talk about. And the others, who possibly might be partners in any kind of a dialogue or discussion. If not today, then tomorrow, the day after. We unite them against us. We are very clever in doing that. Now, radical Islam does something more than that. It wants to abolish politics. You cannot have ordinary people, men, creatures, creations of God, substitute for God, because God has already said what should be done in life, in organized human life. He said it in the Quran, in the Hadith, he said it in the Sharia. Are you going to make laws? What kind of laws? The laws are already there. This is the abolition of political life as such. And more people join this. I don't know how many, nobody knows. You can't make public opinion polls in Pakistan, you know. And there are gradations. It's not the same thing everywhere. But the movement, the ideas, the ideology is pervading a huge number of people. 1.2 billion in the world. Now, you see, when I look at it that way, I find parallels between that, National Socialism, and Soviet communism. All three were or are religions. Nobody will deny that National Socialism was a religion. Without a God, okay. Belief system that you had to believe in unconditionally. I don't have to tell you about St. Mark's and the Holy Lenin and the Kratky Kurs, the short history of the Soviet Communist Party that everybody had to learn in those countries. All three of them wanted to control the world. All three of them wanted to abolish politics. Put the party and the leader instead of it. And all three of them targeted Jews. I don't have to talk about National Socialism. Soviet communism developed into that until the early 1950s with a plan to deport the Jews of the Soviet Union to the tundra and the taiga of Siberia. And as far as the radical Islam is concerned, it's explicit. It's not, as has already been pointed out, it's not just a genocidal danger. It's a concrete genocidal threat. We are not in the 1930s for a number of reasons, but we are in the 1930s. In two ways. First of all, because the threat of annihilation of the Jewish people is there. And second, because as then the Jewish people are sitting quiet, don't realize what's going on, burying our heads in the sand. I told you last night, those of you who were there, of the Forum on Anti-Semitism of the government of Israel. This is not left or right. This started with a left-wing government, now it's a right-wing government. They listen very politely. They appreciate what you say. They think that you are absolutely right. The result is zilch, nothing. This is no longer a political issue. It's a psychological issue. They get the information and they have no knowledge. And so you see, I would separate these issues. You can influence media in the West, maybe, towards radical Islam. You have to adopt completely different tactics, a completely different strategy. And you need allies. The Europeans, just as in the 1930s, the intellectuals that thought that Hitler had a point, and in the 1950s, that Stalin really what he wanted was equality and brotherhood in the world. There's nothing as weak as academic intellectuals. And I always tell my students, don't trust professors. It is absolutely essential for us to realize that the only way that we can fight radical Islam is with the help of the superpower that as long as it is with us, it is with us. And the problem with that superpower is that they think that the only answer to these things is brutal force. And that's a total mistake. You cannot fight an ideology with brutal force alone. I'm no pacifist. I'm in favor of military action. But when you say only military action, you do nothing else. It's a good medicine for total failure. You have to begin a process of ideological persuasion. And you can't do that without liberal Muslims. It has been pointed out that there are not too many of them. But there are some. It's a beginning. The Americans knew how to do it towards the Soviet Union. There was Voice of America, there was and so on and so forth. They completely failed today. There's no attempt even to explain to that huge world what they're doing and why they're doing it. Never mind anti-Semitism. But radical Islam attacks them through us. We'll be in the forefront. We are the immediate victims. I'm not in favor of Jewish victimology because we can't defend ourselves. But then the next ones are they. Now they know it theoretically. Again, a vast difference between information and knowledge. And secondly, of course, you cannot deal with a Muslim world which is suffering, which is poor, which is where there's hopelessness and despair, without a proper economic plan. Not a Marshall Plan, because the Marshall Plan works through governments. The governments in the Muslim world are corrupt, dictatorial regimes. And if you channel any funds to them, you channel them to the pockets of these dictators and corrupt politicians. It's got to be done differently. Nobody's thinking about it. Nobody's doing anything about it. You can't attack radical Islam only with bombs. You must attack it with other means as well. And then they will be fighting their fight, which is also our fight. So, where do we end with this? Well, we don't. You know, I made a suggestion to Abe Foxman when he was here. Is Ken still here? No. When was he here? Two months ago, right? And we had a meeting, and I told him, look, you have a problem with the Western media, a serious problem. Why don't you make a conference in Europe? Not you, because you'll be immediately marked, and through others. media people. Have it in London, have it in Berlin, have it in Brussels, have it anywhere, in Europe, and invite media people to it. And the title of that conference should be Media Bias Regarding Racism, Anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia. You'll attract them, they'll come, and then give your message. Marvelous idea. 2 months ago, nothing. Nothing. Can you penetrate the media? Well, you could perhaps, if you suggest, for instance, a TV play that could make money for the TV station and introduce subjects that you want. Again, it was suggested by me to people. Brilliant idea. We'll do it. Nothing happened. Now, I would suggest several strategies. Not strategies, actually, tactics. Because the strategy, of course, is fighting them. One is to join anti-genocidal campaigns. To say, obviously, we Jews are against genocide. I mean, clear. We are going to support any effort in the world that will target genocide and try to prevent it. As the Jewish Bund in Poland used to say before the war, for yours and our future. In order to do this, join. Don't oppose. Join. The second thing is, and there again somebody else stole my thunder, and namely Alan. We worked together on a couple of films in the past, so I'm not unacquainted with his way of thinking. You are trying to get things into Israeli media, into Israeli TV. That's very difficult. You might try it with an American station, and if they broadcast it, then the Israeli TV will copy it. That is the way to get into the Israeli media. But that can be done. It can be done. You should support young scriptwriters, or not so young scriptwriters. I mean, I'm no longer that young, you know. I'm not a scriptwriter, thank God for that. But why don't you support scriptwriters who write good stuff, professional stuff, which will sell, and then submit it to the powers that be. And yes, make scandals, as many scandals as you can. They will attract attention. You will get your little piece of time in the various media. And I think one of the aims of our endeavors should be perhaps to succeed to convince our own government here and the Jewish organizations and groups abroad to see reality as it is. Robert surprised me last night when he told me that we are actually online. This little thing there actually films me. I decided to overcome my natural shyness in order to say in front of that camera exactly what I think. There's much more that I would like to say, but there's a Shabbat coming, and there's luncheon coming, and there are all kinds of things that people have to do in order to carry on their ordinary lives. And one of the great things about this country, I'm so critical of it. I'm so critical of its government. I'm so critical of its prime minister. But it's a great thing that when you look even at this city of Jerusalem, the concert halls are full. The theater halls are full. Readings of poetry, of literature, dance, everything that you can think of. The answer of the Jewish people to these threats is contained in one word: Dafka.
Before you all disperse, I think it's only right, out of fairness to both to the people who prepared this conference and those who participated in it, to say a few words of thanks. So if you'll just bear with me, I know the hour is late. First of all, none of this would have been possible given the particularly uncertain and difficult circumstances in which this had to be put together, a conference of 3.5 days in which many people from abroad came and gave of their time, of their wisdom, and provided us with a very rich and varied insights into this phenomenon, and also some very valuable practical suggestions which I think we need time to digest and think through. I think it's only right, first of all, to mention the staff of the Vidal Sassoon Center who helped me in the organization and planning of this. Ruchama Roth, in charge of the administration. Jonathan Deckel-Kane, whom you're already familiar with. Our two senior research associates who participated in the conference, Leon Volovich and Simcha Epstein. Sarah Grossfeld, who's in charge of our computer graphics and other related matters. Alifa and Naomi and Martina and Abigail, all of whom really performed over and above the call of duty, and I mean that. And especially I'd like to thank the magnificent audience who throughout these 3.5 days has been with us, followed these proceedings with rapt attention, with intelligent questions. I can't remember a single stupid question, which I think is a new record in conferences at the Hebrew University. And as Yehuda mentioned, all of these proceedings were not only recorded, we have the complete visual record of them, but they were online in real time. So people out there, I don't know how many and whom, out there in North America, in Europe, could have followed much of what was said here. I think that already was an example of outreach. I can also assure you that we intend to do something constructive, something positive with regard both to what was said here and the next steps. I would therefore like to take the opportunity from here to request from every one of the participants that they provide us in reasonable time, as soon as possible, with a definitive or as close to definitive version of what they said. Many people have come up to me from the audience and asked, can I see the paper of X, Y, and Z? A remarkable number of requests. So I think this should be a motivation for the participants. That is the more conventional channel. We will guarantee a way of publishing them. We'll think about the modus of doing that. Suggestions were made here, perhaps not a single book of all the proceedings. There are different ways to proceed, but we will publish them. We'll also work on a edited version of all of these proceedings, which I hope that we can use effectively as a means of transmitting to the wider world many of the very, very important insights which I think we have been able to listen to. And finally, what can I say at the end of the day? Anti-Semitism is an infinite subject. It contains within it not the whole of Jewish history, of course, but both less and more. It links us to our relationship as Jews with the wider world. It has been a constant in Jewish history, with ups and downs, with cycles, with waves. I'm not necessarily a partisan of wave theory. There are particle theories, there are all kinds of theories, but there is no doubt it has been there as a constant. Now we are living in a new time with new challenges. I think they have been very clearly explained and analyzed here. Of course, we need time to digest it. I think important distinctions were made. I think that we need to think about them. In what ways we can really devise a strategy, because if we don't do it, and if we don't help ourselves, if we don't stand up for ourselves, as Hillel said, although there were two parts to the equation, nobody else will. Thank you very much for your attention.